All right, let's continue our study of Abraham. Again, I want to go back to chapter 12. This is kind of the anchor passage on Abraham. Chapter 12, starting verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your family, from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. You shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Verse 2, I will make you a great nation. What's the very first step in having a nation?
Children descended.
How many do you have to have?
At least one.
At least one.
You have to have one. You could have more, but you have to have one so that that child can have children, and then you can have grandchildren and build a nation. But at this point, how many children did Abraham have? Zero. He had no children when God called him. And I think we talked about it. Remember how old he was in Genesis 12? I don't expect, maybe we didn't mention the exact number. 70. He was 70 years old. So, you know, he's wondering if he'll, you know, when is this going to happen? I'm 70 years old. You know how old his wife was, Sarai? 60. She's 10 years younger than Abraham, so she was 60. Now, when God says, "I'll make you a great nation," we talked about that, and he said, "I will bless you." How important is a man as Abraham at this stage? How important is he?
The most.
Thank you. He is the most important man in the world. Why would that be?
Because God's going to use him to bring about messianic lineage and everything.
Yeah. And how does that affect the rest of the world?
It affects every nation that we're reading about.
Right. So he's the most important man in the world. And when God says, "I will bless you," that's pretty neat that Abraham was told, basically he's the most important man in the world. Through him's going to come a nation to bless all the nations. And, you know, he just was a very blessed man to know that God was going to bless him in the most special way. But when we get to chapter 16, that's where we want to come today. The first thing that we read in chapter 16 is that Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. Now, at this point, this is 15 years later, Abraham is 85 and she's 75. So they were promised a child 15 years before, and now there's no children. And Abraham, and especially Sarai, are getting impatient and nervous. And I guess I could say she especially comes up with an idea to help God out. God needs a little help here. And I mean that. That's exactly what she's going to say. We got to help God out. So it says in the rest of verse 1, she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abraham, "See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go in to my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her." And that means just what it says. Go have relations with my maid girl, and if she has a child, then I'll adopt the child, or that child, because the child is in my household, the child will be considered mine. And that was a custom in that day. That was something that people did. And what, without reading any further, what would we hope that Abraham would say right there?
No.
This is not a good idea.
Good. Good. And okay, no is the best answer. Now, if he was going to, if Sarai said, "Well, why?" What would have been a good answer?
That's a bad idea.
That's good. What else?
Lord doesn't want me to do that.
Yeah.
That's a plan.
What?
Waiting on God's promise.
Yeah, we can trust God with this.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. God made us a promise. I mean, it's taken 15 years, but God's God. We can trust Him. He'll keep His promise.
This kind of sounds like the Adam Eve thing.
Yeah, a little bit. Yes. Yes. And he also could have said, "It's not right. You're my wife." That would be immoral. I can't do this. This wouldn't be right. So at the end of verse 3, what did Abram do? Or excuse me, the end of verse 2. The end of verse 2, what did he do?
Agreed.
Yeah, he heeded the voice of Sarai. He listened to her. Then we read in verse 3, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. Now that, I mean, she was still his wife, but to have another wife, so to speak.
This would have been a good time for him to say, hey, let's talk to God about this, and let's see if we can't hear him one more time say, yeah, it's coming.
Yeah, good. After Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So they'd been 10 years in Canaan. So hopefully he's going to think twice about this before he goes through with it. But he doesn't. In verse 4, he went in to Hagar and she conceived. All right. Now, when they found out that Hagar was present, what conclusion might Sarai and Abraham have come to?
He's shooting live ammo.
Yeah. Yeah, that would have been a...
They might have come to the conclusion it wasn't it.
Huh?
They could have come to the conclusion that it wasn't.
What did you say?
They did the
What
right
was your
thing.
question?
What could they have thought or concluded when Hagar got pregnant? And Don?
Said they could have concluded that maybe this was right, this is what God wanted.
Yeah. I could hear them saying, hey, God must be in this. I'm 85 years old and God worked a miracle here. And Hagar's present, so I guess God is blessing our plan. I don't know that that's what they said, but I could see where they might have. This is what their plan was, and it seems to be working.
That's the classic, I guess God's okay with this. I mean, this scenario is played out every day, all day, among God's people who do ungodly things. I mean, I'm happy. I think this is okay with God.
Yeah. God hasn't struck me dead, so I guess it's okay. All right? But then look at the end of verse 4. And when she saw, this is Hagar, when Hagar saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. That means Sarai. What's it mean to despise? You know?
Look down upon.
Yeah, look down upon. She looked down upon her. In what way, what we think Hagar was thinking when it says here, she looked down upon Sarah. What might she have been thinking to look down upon Sarai?
Like a slave service.
Yeah, pardon?
God chose me instead of her.
Yeah. I'm the one that God chose,
Yeah.
not you. What else could she have been thinking? That's the most important thing.
That
I
she
got
was
the baby, nanny, nanny, boo, boo.
Yeah. Which woman might have been a little bit prettier?
Change it, maybe.
Certainly we know which one was younger. Maybe a little prettier. Maybe the woman that would think, well, I'm more pleasing to Abram than you because I'm giving him a child and you couldn't or didn't. So there's a lot of women jealousy and attitude going on here, because not only did Hagar look down upon Sarai, how do you think Sarai took it? She's not happy, as we read in verse 5. Then Sarai, I feel like laughing when I read this. Sarai said to Abraham, "My wrong be upon you." What's she saying?
It's your fault.
It's your fault.
Yeah.
It's your fault.
That happens a lot.
I gave my maid into your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between you and me, Abraham. What's she saying? What's she saying?
Even though he took Abraham's side, not her side? He judged between you and me?
Well, I don't think so. It really goes along with my wrong be upon you. The Lord judge between you and me.
She's leaving it up to God to choose which one was right and
Yeah.
which one was wrong.
Yeah. I know you're wrong, and even the Lord would agree with me. It's kind of what she's saying here. The Lord would say, I'm innocent and you're wrong. She's piling on her being upset with Abram.
Bob,
Uh-huh.
I just thought, I wonder if when they were, after 15 years, not able to have a child, maybe also they had a thought against each other, well, it's your fault.
Yeah.
And he's saying, no, it's your fault.
Mm-hmm.
And then when she had to get with Hagar and she had a child, she's going, it's my fault. You know, like Russ said, he was shooting loaded bullets.
Yeah.
So maybe she really felt guilty, you know, like there's something wrong with me, and that maybe helped her lash out.
Yeah. That's true.
Just a thought.
Yeah. She could have had feelings of guilt, but trying to displace it by focusing on Abraham. What did she expect of Abram here? What's she upset with him about?
He should have refused to begin with.
Okay, maybe she's saying you shouldn't have listened to me. I don't know. What else might she been upset about? What would be the most immediate thing she would be upset about?
Infidelity.
Maybe.
Well, we don't know the relationship, how it changed between Abraham and the maidservant.
Yeah.
That he might have pushed Sarai away a little bit more.
Yeah, could be. What do you think she's expecting him to do about Hagar? Hagar's treating her bad.
Send her away.
Thank you.
Either send her away or put her in her place. You know, get involved here and get her to quit treating me the way she's treating me. Something like that.
The poor guy doesn't stand a chance here. I mean, he's put in a really hard situation, and he should have manned up and went to God about it, but he's probably living under the dog knows he can whip the skunk, it's just not worth it
Yeah.
theory.
So what specifically could he do with these two women right here? What could he have done at this point?
Gotten rid of them.
Both of them. Started up.
That's a bad answer. That's a bad answer. Shame on you.
There you go.
What would be a better answer than Wes's?
He took them down and had a talk with them.
Could have sat him down and had a talk with him. And what could he have said? What would be the godly thing for this man to do at this point?
I did the wrong thing, and this is the right thing, I'm going to treat you right, Hagar, but, Sarah's my focus, so I'm going straight with her.
You definitely hit the nail on the head in your first comment. I did the wrong thing. I was wrong. I have caused trouble for both of you. I shouldn't have listened to you, Sarah. I should have stood up and led you to do what God would want us to do. And Hagar was definitely wrong in what I did with you. I got you involved in something that I took advantage of you. You're a servant girl. You would have had a hard time refusing because you're our servant. I mean, this was great what Doug just said, and I agree with him. Abraham should have gotten, the phrase Jesus used, get the plank out of your own eye. Get the sin out of your own eye. Fess up to what you've done wrong. He should have done that right here, and then talk to them about what they need to do once he had humbled himself and faced his own wrong. He would have said to Sarai, Sarai, this is where we're at. We shouldn't have done it. I shouldn't have gone along with you. We've got to make the best of it. Hagar, you got to quit treating Sarai that way. It's not helping the cause at all. It's not right for you to treat her like that. That kind of thing. I'm saying all this to contrast what he actually did, because that's what we read next, verse 6. So Abram said to Sarai, indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please. What do you think about that? What's he doing here?
You handle it. Passing the buck.
Put it right in her.
Yeah.
I don't want to get involved.
I don't want to get involved. You two you do to her what you choose. I'm not getting involved. What a coward. This is a terrible moment right here for Abram, to just passively let these two women continue in this situation and not take the leadership that he needed to take. So in verse 6, at the end of verse 6, when Sarai dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence. Hagar fled from Sarai's presence. Now, we don't have details here, but what details might we suspect are behind the words, she dealt harshly with her?
Probably blamed her for sleeping with her husband.
Yeah, could have. She blamed Abraham, so
Blamed her for something.
yeah.
Kind of smart of Hagar, because she's with a contentious woman, a man that doesn't support her,
Yeah.
father of her babies. That's probably the best thing to get out of that.
Yeah, Hagar probably did the right thing, is just getting away from her because she couldn't reason with her. This isn't Sarai's shining moment, again, to treat her maidservant harshly. Sarai's the one that got her into the whole situation to begin with. And it must have been pretty harsh for Hagar to just have to run away. All right, so we keep reading in verse 7. Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from and where are you going? We want to identify the angel of the Lord. I'm going to skip ahead to verse 13, if you'll go down to verse 13 with me, and we'll peek ahead to identify who this is. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees. For she said, have I also here seen him who sees me? Based on those words, who is the angel of the Lord? Jesus. It's Jesus. It's the Lord himself. And the angel of the Lord is a term for Jesus as he appeared a number of times in the Old Testament. So when we go back up to verse 7, the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness. by the spring on the way to Shur. That's Jesus who met with her. Verse 8, he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. So what's the difference between him and Abraham? What's the difference between what Jesus is doing and what Abraham did?
At least they're obviously showing compassion and care and concern for her well-being,
Yeah,
where Abraham didn't.
right, right. And he's being active. He's actively advising what to do in this situation. Abraham said, you do to her what you want. I don't want to get involved. The Lord says, here's what you need to do. Go back. You're still the servant. You submit to her and have the right attitude toward her in the midst of this awkward and difficult situation. All right, then the Lord says in verse 10, now the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly so that they shall not be counted for multitude. What's that mean, they shall not be counted for multitude?
There'll be a whole bunch of them.
Yeah, so many you couldn't count them. Let's keep reading. The angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are with child, you shall bear a son. You shall call his name what? Because the Lord has heard your affliction. He will be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. He shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. There's a lot there. Do you know who the descendants of Ishmael are?
The Arabs.
The Arabs. The Arabs are descendants of Ishmael. Jim.
So, in reading this, is Ishmael then the second born of Hagar?
No, I don't think so.
Well, it said, she's already had a baby. Maybe she hadn't already had a baby.
No, she hadn't had it yet.
Okay.
Yeah,
She was just pregnant. Okay.
yeah. This is the first child of Hagar. Who would the brethren? Okay, Ishmael is the father of the Arabs. By the way, Arabs, even today, they rightly say that they are descendants of Abraham. Through whom?
Ishmael.
Ishmael. And Arabs today recognize that. We are descendants through Ishmael. Ishmael is our forefather, but Abraham is our forefather through his son Ishmael. So it's right up until this day, it's still recognized among the descendants of Ishmael who they are. They are the Arab people.
Was that any kin to the Egyptians since she was an Egyptian?
No, no.
Why would that change if she was Egyptian?
Well, because the lineage is designated through the father. And just like Moses, he married an Ethiopian, but his children were considered his descendants. Okay.
I think it's kind of neat that she was talked into this knowing her child would be the father of nations. And God honored that. And still, with a different nation, He still honored that to her because of what she did up to the nation.
Yeah, and he chose to let's see. Is the word bless in here? I can't remember. I will multiply your descendants.
I wouldn't use the word phase.
I would think we'd have to make an assumption that Hagar had adopted the beliefs of Abraham and Sarai, that she knew who the angel of the Lord was. So if she was basically innocent, following the lead of Sarai and Abram, she probably may have well thought that everything she did was, she was totally innocent in it. So I think it gets back to what you said, God's honoring her faith in him at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that even though it's not written, it's only written that God talked to Abraham. It's not written that God talked to Sarai concerning this matter.
Right.
Then later on it shows that evidently Hagar had been in contact, or God had been in contact. Well, that's what I get. It's leaving Sarai out of the deal that God spoke to her concerning this.
Yeah, it doesn't seem at this point that he spoke to her. Yeah. The last part of verse 12, he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. Who would his brethren be?
The descendants of whoever the one chosen was supposed to be that came through Abraham
Yeah.
and Sarah.
Yeah, the other, whatever child of Abraham, if there's going to be another child of Abraham, would that be Ishmael's brother?
Yes.
Yes, of course. And when it says, this is very important, this is maybe the most important thing we're going to need to notice, he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren, that would be a reference to the descendants of Abraham's other child who has not yet been born. But we know he's going to be born. You remember, or know his name? Isaac. Abraham is going to have a son by Sarai named Isaac, and his descendants will be the so-called brethren of Ishmael's descendants. So there's a huge prophecy here that the descendants of Ishmael will dwell in the presence of the descendants of Isaac, or the Arabs will dwell in the presence of the Jews.
My translation says, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers.
That's in a previous verse, right?
In verse 12.
In verse 12.
In verse 12.
Oh, at the end of verse 12?
And he will live in hostility toward all his brothers.
Interesting. That's an interesting translation. The first part of the verse implies it, though. He will be a wild man.
Yeah.
His hand shall be against every man. Now, every man's an interesting term. That's not a limited term, is it? Be against every man, every man's hand against him. But then in particular, he shall dwell in the midst of his brethren, the sons of the descendants of Isaac, which we later know to be the Jews. So let's think about this, especially that last part. He shall dwell. Well, let's talk about the every man part. He shall be a wild man, his hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. Can you think of an illustration maybe in our lifetime where that prophecy was fulfilled?
Iran comes to mind. They're mad at everybody.
Interesting you said Iran. Is Iran Arab?
They're Persian.
They're Persian. So good guess, but no, that doesn't count because the Iranians, no, the Iranians are Persians. They are not Arabs.
The guy, Osama bin Laden comes to my mind. I mean, he just would kill anybody he could.
Uh-huh. Yes. What was the nationality? Thank you. And that's, I'm going to follow that thought.
Is George's prince, is he Arab?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He's against everybody, and everybody's against him.
Uh-huh. There's a lot of conflict there over Jordan. What nationality were the 9/11 hijackers? All of them. Arab.
Yeah,
They were sons of Ishmael, and proudly so. Who were they against?
Everybody.
Yeah, virtually everybody, and everybody was against them. Let's think about Israel. Now this is amazing what I want to share with you, in my opinion. When did the Arabs dwell in the presence of the Jews? In other words, when did they become recognizably in the presence of each other? When you go back in the Old Testament, you don't see it. Because in the Old Testament, the conflict, who were the Jews in conflict with in the Old Testament? Can you name some people that?
Canaanites, Hittites.
Canaanites, Hittites.
Emirates.
Who? Amorites.
Jebusites.
The Babylonians.
Amorites.
The Assyrians. The Medo-Persians. The Romans. How many of those groups I just mentioned are Arabs? None of them. There was no close proximity of Arabs and Jews and hostility between Arabs and Jews in the Old Testament. Now, then we come to the days of Jesus. We still don't have hostility between Arabs and Jews. And how about for 1900 years after Jesus, did we have hostility between Arabs and Jews?
No.
Why not?
Because they hadn't made the break, jump to light speed with a different religious view.
But where were the Jews for 1900 years? Scattered. They weren't there in the land. They were spread out all over the world. So there was no living in the presence of Arabs for 1900 years. When is the first time then that we see Jews living in the presence of Arabs?
1947?
Yeah, you're on the right track. The 20th century. And it happened gradually when the Jews came back into the land. There were Arab nations all around that land. Okay? All around that land. I gave you a little map. Look at the map. What's the red? What is the prominent population? What's the prominent people of Israel? What do you think the green, I think you know, what would the green represent?
Arab nations.
The Arab nations.
So
And
Egypt is an Arab nation.
yes. Yeah, and I'm not, they're Arabs, so Doug, that's a good question. Hagar was an Egyptian. Maybe that's part of my answer to you. Maybe I don't know, I don't understand how God counted all that, but today they are considered.
All of that was Arab.
Yeah.
Wow.
Now, when we look at that map, we can surely see that the verse we're looking at has been fulfilled, that the Jews and Arabs are dwelling in the presence of one another,
Yeah.
to say the least. Israel is totally surrounded by Arab nations. Do you know about how many Jews there are in Israel?
6 million.
6 million. And do you have any idea how many? You may not. I wouldn't. I looked it up.
1.2.
How many Arabs there are in those green nations?
1.2 billion.
No. I read 330 million. 330 million. And 80 to 100% of the population in all those green countries are Arabs.
What is United Arab Emirates? What does Emirates mean?
I don't remember.
Emirates.
I don't remember.
Kind of representative of all of them being Arabs.
Are we leading up to the Temple Mount?
No?
It's on the other side of Saudi Arabia, so kind of in my mind.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of conflict in the Temple Mount between Jews and Arabs, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's right.
Or tension, that's the word. Now, when Israel declared themselves a state, what year was that?
48.
1948. What happened immediately when Israel declared their statehood?
War.
War between whom? Arabs. Those green nations, especially the ones immediately surrounding Israel, tried to destroy Israel. Literally. There was a war. The Arab nations immediately waged war against this tiny little nation to take them out. How successful was that? It didn't work. And you can just look at the map. You can just look at the map and see there's some kind of miracle going on here.
Yeah, God warred for 6 days and then rested.
Yeah, well, now we go to 1967. In 1967, what happened in relation to the map?
Another war.
Yeah, another war, the 6-Day War, where the Arab nations tried to destroy Israel again. So there was a war in 48, a war in 67, where the Arab nations, the descendants of Ishmael, tried to literally take out the nation of Israel. And what was the outcome of that?
Didn't work out too well.
No. 6 days. It only took 6 days. It was a miracle. It was a miracle of God. No other way to explain it. It was a miracle that God stood behind Israel, because God's plan was to have Israel back in the land, preparing for the last days and the second coming. Here's what I want to suggest to you. As you look at verse 12, when could we say that verse was fulfilled?
Dwelling in the present?
Yeah. Yeah, the 20th century. Specifically, 1948 was the kind of the focal point. But that verse was fulfilled in the 20th century, 1948, and it's still, in fulfillment today. Now, I didn't talk about this earlier. When did Abraham live? What century? Do you know?
500?
No. 2000 BC. Abraham's easy because he was 2,000 years before Christ, and we're 2,000 years after Christ. That's how I remember it. This sin, and I'm calling it sin, that Sarah came up with, had consequences, didn't it?
Amen.
It had consequences immediately, and consequences how many years later?
Today.
4,000 years later.
Yeah.
Now that's amazing. That sin had consequences 4,000 years later, and really the fulfillment of it was 4,000 years later. What lesson can we learn from that?
Consequences, careful to our actions.
Yeah. They came up with a scheme that they wanted God to bless.
Bless.
And the scheme backfired big time. Of course, God still was in control, right? And He's used it to accomplish His purpose. And He's still using it to accomplish His purpose. But it's a pretty powerful lesson that when we come up with our own schemes of what we think that we do, and we expect God to bless these schemes, that we can't expect that God's going to bless, because those schemes will bring consequences. Can you think of an example or two or three about schemes that a Christian could come up with today and expecting God to bless, and it doesn't? We shouldn't expect that God would, that there would be consequences.
Marriage and divorce.
Okay? Explain that a little bit.
Y'all know that once you get married, you're supposed to stay married. You have a lot of people that decide that they're unhappy and they don't want to do that, so they get a divorce. They think because they care about someone else, it's just perfectly okay to get married again.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't meet certain criteria. criteria, so they just pursue their own avenue of what they think's going to make them happy, and they think God's going to go along with it.
And that's a good illustration. I want to give a quick footnote to that. There is, God gives an exception to what you just said in the Bible. Generally speaking, what you said is true, but there is an exception. What's the exception?
Infidelity.
Yeah, infidelity. God allows for divorce and remarriage for infidelity.
Or death.
Or death, yes. Right. Okay.
Talking about like schemes that I raised $2 million, you'll save my life or something like that. Or what do you call it?
No. Sinful scheme. Not a bargain. That's another story. But a sinful scheme. Scheme that a person would try to justify and expecting God to bless a decision that is wrong, but thinking God will bless it.
Like murder?
Well, maybe. What that would be a tough one to justify, but possible.
Well, in your mind, if you were mad at someone, you know.
Yeah.
The murderer always has an excuse.
Yeah. Okay.
There are factions within the church that approve of abortion and all forms of sexual immorality. So, assuming that those people are those factions are actually truly part of the church, they are justifying completely what God says is sin, completely.
Those are very timely illustrations that you just gave, because we've got that in our face today, don't we? That people are, individuals and churches, are justifying immoral relations, thinking God's going to bless it, that God's smiling on it. Yep. We've got it big time today in our world.
How about false teaching?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a scheme or not, but for these preachers that are all about raising the way they raise money
Yeah.
and use it.
Yeah. Thinking that God's blessing them because they're getting all this money, and yet they're deceiving people and they're preaching a false message. And yeah.
The devil hasn't changed his playbook since Adam and Eve, and he just continues to recycle what the society says is okay. People go along with. Abram, it was probably easy for him to go into Hagar because that was accepted back then.
Mm-hmm.
And these practices that we practice in the United States, they're accepted by our society.
Yeah, thank you for coming back to that. Abraham was going along with the culture. They were doing what the culture did. Did I mention that earlier? I don't know if I did. That was cultural. Yeah, I did mention it. So they were justifying it not only based on thinking God would bless their idea, but because everybody else was doing it in their particular circumstance. And that's a huge problem today, is the culture says one thing, God says another thing. Christians that choose to go along with the culture think, well, God understands that, He'll accept that. But this kind of shouts to us that God's standards don't change. Let me, here's another one that God says to forgive those that sin against you. What might a believer scheme, what scheme might a believer come up with on that one?
What brings up this question for us? God says to forgive.
Huh?
What made you think of this question?
I'm trying to illustrate, and I'm trying to give another example of a Christian who doesn't do what God says, thinking that God will bless their decision. And I'm illustrating it, a Christian that says, I'm not going to forgive him for what he did to me. Or I'm not going to forgive her for what she did to me. thinking,
Well, whether you forgive them or not, God forgives them. So if God forgives them, then it's basically mandatory that you forgive.
yeah, I agree with you.
I see in this story, God forgave Abraham and Sarah. He
Yeah,
also forgave Hagar and blessed all of them.
yeah,
But when you go down that road, you're leaving yourself open to a lot of repercussions that God. One is, if you don't forgive the person, then you are basically in sin, and therefore God can't hear your prayers because you're out of fellowship with the Lord.
yes, that's my point. There are consequences to bitterness. Bitterness is the opposite of forgiveness. If I refuse to forgive somebody and expect God to bless me, should I expect God to bless me?
No.
That's my point.
So would you say Sarah, when she treated Hagar harshly, you could use the word she was bitter?
Yeah. Yeah,
Even though he forgave them, though, the consequences of that sin didn't
Still
go
there.
away.
right,
We're still living under it.
right,
Yeah.
right. How about another example? Somebody does you wrong. Somebody sins against you. What does Jesus say to do?
Go to them and work it out.
Yeah, not just forgive them, but what? Go to them and talk to them about it. And what might we choose to do?
I'm not going to do that.
I'm not going to go talk to them about it. I'm just going to stay mad. And I'm just bringing that up as an example of how we can justify our scheme to say, I know that's what Jesus said to do, but I'm not going to do it. But I'm going to believe that he's still going to bless me, even though I won't do what he told me to do. So there's another example of how important it is for us just to do what Jesus said to do and not think that we can go against him and he's still going to bless our efforts in life.
And sometimes we justify it by using scripture. Be angry, but do not sin.
Yeah.
You sinned against me and I'm mad at you, but I hadn't sinned.
Well, yeah, well, that would be a
That's now, is the fact to go talk to them, because they might not even be realize that they may be mad at one another.
As men, we can kind of come away from this. It's our responsibility to know what God expects of us, what's moral, and then it's up to us to have the fortitude to do the right thing.
exactly.
Let me put a personal touch on this for you guys. I was not a good husband to my first wife. I cheated on her. And ultimately, I justified my divorcing her because it would be better for the kids to be raised in her home rather than in our home with us fighting all the time. And so I divorced her. And the relationship for years was strained at best. And but a few years after the divorce, I admitted to myself that I was the bad guy. She wasn't. She was a good wife. She was a good mother. So I went to her and I apologized for my actions. And in that same moment, she forgave me. And that changed our lives completely at that moment. Betty's a good friend of mine today. She comes up, she was in my house Easter. Every time we have a family gathering, she's there. And we have a great time. Everybody's there. As a matter of fact, some Sundays she'll come over just to visit. I go upstairs and her and Teresa sit down and talk for hours. But the point I'm trying to make is that admitting, number one, that you're wrong, you've wronged someone, going to that person and apologizing is powerful. And when they forgive you, it's even more powerful.
That's a home run testimony right there, because you illustrated the most important things that we've learned today from your own life. And that is, God didn't bless your scheme, but God salvaged the situation when you turned to Him for forgiveness and grace. And when you humbled yourself and admitted what you did was wrong, God salvaged and healed. So thank you for sharing that.
No doubt that God did that. I did.
Yeah. So God won't, I think the main thing we take away here is that God won't bless our schemes, but God will forgive and heal if we've been involved in one, if we turn to Him.
So don't you think that Sarah forgave Hagar and that relationship was mended for everything else to be fulfilled as God had promised another son coming? Or
well, let's see what happens later in the story. Right now, things aren't going too good between them, but we have learned that God's still in control.
That'll make you come back next week.
One more point.
Yeah.
Is, in all the peace stuff that's going on in the Middle East, when President Trump was in, it goes back to this, because they're bringing them together because they both have contact with Abraham, with the descendant Abraham.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that.
They're using
There's a movement right now of the Arabs drawing closer to the Jews, those immediate Arab nations. I'm so glad you said that. It's an interesting thing going on right now.
They're using that relationship
yeah.
to bring them together.
And they're using their common heritage in Abraham.
Yeah.
The Abraham Accords. Mm-hmm. That was a brilliant name for the treaties. Yeah. Because it brought them together under their common father, Abraham.
Wow.
And it's still alive. That movement is still alive.
And their common enemy are the Persians.
Yeah. Yep.
Somebody brought up something about one quick point here is about the UAE. The United Arab Emirates is a group of 7 territories that each territory is ruled by an emir. And these 7 emirs have gotten together and created this United Arab Emirates. So, and the emirate is an emir that, that's how they name their territory.
Okay. Thank you for that background.